Thank you, Ven. Next up, Ryan McClure. Ryan leads Citrix Customer Success Engineering team chartered with helping Citrix's customers accelerate and realize value out of their investments. He'll be sharing planning your next move with Citrix.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the intro, Greg. Really appreciate it. So this conversation a couple of years ago was a little bit easier to have. It was mainly current release or long-term service release, and that was kind of the primary decision point around, what was next and planning out a roadmap for a Citrix environment. But, fast forward to current, and now we've got cloud services to consider. We've still got the long-term service release and current release considerations, OS upgrades to plan around, and all kinds of fun. So this is a conversation we're having a lot with our customers and thought it would be a valuable topic to discuss here some with the group. So like you mentioned, I lead our customer success engineering team globally at Citrix. I've been with Citrix about 9 years now, spent 7 of that with our consulting team, so working hand in hand doing large-scale designs and deployments with customers in the field, and had the opportunity to lead our enterprise architecture team in the central U.S. and Canada for a good piece of that. Probably worked with some of you during that time. But my new team is really focused on subscription customers and, like you mentioned, making sure that those customers realize as much value out of those investments as quickly as they can. A little bit about me. I'm a University of Miami graduate, the warm one down in Florida in the Midwest. I always have to clarify University of Miami versus Miami University, though I'm sure this time of year, Oxford is also very nice. I always used to joke that, the only thing more disappointing than Miami's football team is my golf game, but I actually think my golf game has gotten better faster than Miami's football team. So I'm going to give myself a mediocre plus grade on my golf game lately. And I actually think I've outpaced Miami's football team in terms of improving, which is sad, unfortunately. So in terms of deciding on a next step, the primary decision point that a lot of customers are focused on right now is, what's right for me? Do I stay on long-term service release if that's where I am today? If I was on current release and I, hopped off the train at 1912, do I stay on that long-term service release for a while, or keep pushing ahead with the current release path? Or, ultimately is now the time that I look at making the move to cloud if I'm entitled. So, in terms of comparing the options, there are definitely some considerations to think about. So the first one really is the life cycle. So for long-term service release, it's 5 years support with an optional additional 5 years of extended support. With current release, it's 6 months from the time of release to end of maintenance and 18 months to end of life. One of the really cool things about the cloud service is that the infrastructure itself is evergreen. The VDAs still follow the lifecycle maintenance path of either the LTSR or CR path, depending on what you're on. And you can use anything 7.15 or later from an LTSR perspective with Citrix Cloud. You can also use any supported release of a CR build. In terms of release cadence, roughly every 2 to 3 years, we're releasing a new LTSR build right now. But we do have those CUs every 4 to 6 months. And I think it's fairly common for customers to lose sight of staying current on CUs. So, if they run into a supportability challenge, the next step is, if it's fixed in the next CU, is still to upgrade, which isn't a terribly different place to be than if you're on current release and you need to update to the next CR to get a fix. Obviously, the delta there is that with CUs, it's mainly fixes and security enhancements as opposed to current releases, which may have new features and capabilities that you need to test and figure out how to deploy. With the cloud platform, the release cadence is ongoing. Different microservices are being updated at different times under the hood between kind of an A and B side release model that we have ongoing. The VDA fix model will follow the same path as on-prem. In terms of enhancements and getting access to the latest and greatest, LTSR, obviously that's the thing you're giving up for the longer supportability roadmap. Current release, you're always going to get the latest and greatest, and same thing with the cloud platform, which is being kept evergreen from an infrastructure perspective, and you have the option to either stay LTSR with your VDAs or continue to move those ahead on the CR lifecycle. Service levels is one of the other things that comes up fairly often in terms of considerations around which path to go. So obviously with LTSR and CR environments where they're customer hosted, fully built on customer hosted infrastructure, customers are entirely in control of their ability to deliver a service level. When you go with a cloud deployment, that control starts to be shared between the customer and Citrix, but there are ways that we can design the on-prem elements of the environment to maintain as much of the control over the service level as possible. So in terms of deciding factors, there are a few things to consider around the path forward. So one of the first is, are we planning a major OS or app upgrade? And there are kind of two approaches here. We can either kill two birds with one stone, or we can take more of a limit risk approach and separate out our changes. So the decision here is really kind of where you are today. If you're one of those customers that, let's say, still has some 2008 R2 lying around, or you're on server 2012 and you're trying to get to server 2016, you're probably doing a new image build anyway. You might as well do the VDA upgrade as you're going through that process. If you don't have to make an OS update and it's just an application update, or something similar to that, I kind of like the limit risk path where you make the app update that you need to make, and then you make the VDA update separate if the two aren't codependent from a supportability perspective, because it limits your risk a little bit. So if anything goes wrong, it becomes a little bit more straightforward to troubleshoot. Especially under current environmental conditions, the time to execute is also kind of a key consideration. In some cases, you may not have the luxury of dividing and conquering or taking that limit risk approach, and sometimes it's just faster to do both at once. One of the other big consideration points, probably now more than ever, is do you foresee adding public cloud resource locations to your deployment at any time imminently? If you are planning to deploy public cloud workloads, this is where it really starts to make sense to consider Citrix Cloud. One of the reasons for that is that public cloud workload support has been deprecated in the 2003 release and beyond. The other big reason is that there are some appreciable enhancements in terms of the integration with those public clouds out of the Citrix Cloud version of the infrastructure. So some examples there would include just-in-time provisioning with MCS, premium disk support, those sorts of things. So when you're talking about storage savings, boot times, MCS optimizations, all of those are going cloud first, if not cloud only, in terms of releasing those capabilities. One of the other things that we're seeing customers look at is that the in-place upgrade can actually be higher risk than the cloud migration. So what I mean by that is when I do that in-place upgrade, there's that moment where you're kind of next finishing through the update, and you have that brokering interruption, while the database schema is updated and all that. And there's a risk that something doesn't go right in that process, and then you're having to revert, restore, and if you don't have a multi-site environment, you may actually be in a service interruption moment for your end users. Whereas if you are to kind of migrate those configurations over the cloud service, you can point storefront or workspace or whatever you're using at your cloud connectors and aggregate those so that as you shift users over, the transition is completely transparent for them, and you don't actually have that brokering update moment. You just make the switch as the workload is moved over from the on-prem deployment to the cloud deployment. So a little bit lower risk. For a while, it was a much higher work effort. You had to replicate all of your configurations, whereas with the in-place upgrade, you don't have to do that. They're all there after the update. We actually have tools, they're in private tech preview at the moment, and we'll talk about them shortly here, but tools to help automate that are imminently due to release that I think significantly shift that dynamic. The other consideration is, are there any kind of killer current release features that are really going to change the way that you do business? So one example of these in the past was with UPM 718 when we released that Outlook native search indexing. For a lot of customers that were on Office 365, that was an appreciable difference in their user experience, and that was a moment where it was well worth making the move to current release. But this is a little bit cyclical in my mind. So, when we only are 1 or 2 CRs into the LTSR cycle, the differentiated feature set between CR and LTSR is maybe a little bit smaller. When we're 18, 24 months into that LTSR cycle and 3, 4, 5 CRs have come out since, that differentiated value can be pretty significant. And sometimes it becomes very appropriate to look at going current release for a CR or 2, just like you would probably have a CU update in there, and then get back on the LTSR path when the next LTSR comes out. And then last but not least, particularly in the healthcare space, we're hearing a lot of customers ask questions around, what is supportability of Citrix Cloud with my Epic deployment and all those types of questions. So Epic doesn't provide a target platform for the management components. They're focused on the VDA. So whether it's on-prem infrastructure on LTSR or CR or Citrix Cloud, any of those are eligible to be run with Epic. We do have customers that are running Epic on Citrix Cloud at significant production scale today, so tens of thousands of users plus. And the use of Citrix Cloud also does not impact your eligibility for honor roll. So it's something where we're seeing a lot of healthcare customers start to evaluate, hey, is this transition starting to make sense so that we can offload that infrastructure management and the upgrades associated and focus on our end user experience and some of the other priorities that we have, delivering value and a positive experience to our caregivers, particularly, again, given current environmental conditions. So I talked a little bit about tooling to help with that cloud migration, and this is what I was mentioning. So this tool is not generally available yet today. We expect the tech preview here to happen here relatively shortly, so definitely keep an eye out. But the intent of this tool, the primary intent, is to allow you to rapidly export those configurations from your on-prem site and import them into a Citrix Cloud instance. So significantly reducing the work effort on the admin side to make that transition. There's also no impact to end users. It's not like we're flipping over all your VDAs at the same time or anything like that. This just imports all of your catalog, delivery group, application, tag, policy configurations, those sorts of things. And then at your discretion, you can push a GPO to flip your VDAs over to being pointed at a cloud connector and change your storefront site aggregation config or your workspace config as required so that users are launching resources brokered by the app and desktop service as opposed to your on-prem environment. Assuming all goes well, you can then spin down and decommission your on-prem environment. This tool will be fully supported once it's GA. I know that there are some third-party tools out there, and that's always a question I get from customers like, okay, let's say I run one of those and I have an issue. Is Citrix going to help? This tool will be fully supported once it's GA. And the other cool thing about it is that it's not just for that one-time migration. So it allows both a replace and a merge model. So you can use it for pre-production to production change management. If you've got multiple cloud instances for some reason that you need to keep aligned, it can help with that. If you want to back up a known good configuration so that you can restore to it if and when necessary, it gives you the option to do that. And it can also help you merge configurations from, let's say, multiple sites on-prem into a single Citrix Cloud instance if that's the direction you're going architecturally in the future. So this is something I think will really help admins as they consider the transition, and makes that lower risk approach of like, okay, that in-place upgrade is always a moment where I'm holding my breath, seeing if it's going to work. Let me take the lower risk path to the app and desktop service, and this significantly reduces my work effort in doing so. One of the other questions I get a lot is just how widely used the app and desktop service is and what other customers are doing in their environment. So, where they are in terms of OS versions, where they've got resources deployed. So I went ahead and pulled some telemetry from the app and desktop service that I thought was pretty interesting. So first and foremost, about 350,000 managed workloads, so essentially PDAs off of the app and desktop service today. The location distribution there, about 45% on-prem, 15% in a public cloud, 26% remote PC, which that number was significantly lower prior to the pandemic. Remote PC has been a huge use case in terms of how customers have repurposed existing hardware to allow users to work from home during the pandemic. So that number has increased significantly. And then another 16% or so where the workloads are unmanaged from a host connection perspective. In terms of sessions per month, about 45 million of those out of the app and desktop service any given month, and that represents around 1.3 million unique users a month. When you look at the OS distribution, this raised my eyebrows for a minute that it's 70% Win 10. My brain immediately went to, where is the 80-20, 70-30 distribution of like server OS to desktop OS? But that's really a by user stat. So we're still at about 60% of sessions running off of a server operating system versus 40% of sessions running off of a desktop operating system. In terms of the server OS, 2016 has kind of taken over the lead. Server 2012 not too far behind, and there are definitely still some customers out there on Windows 7. Server 2019, not a huge share yet, only 2%. VDA versions, I think not a tremendous surprise, 72% LTSR, 28% current release. I would think the distribution's probably a little higher towards CR on the cloud side than on-prem, but probably not terribly different. The provisioning number, though, I do think is significantly different because of the number of customers running workloads on public cloud with the app and desktop service. Those customers are running MCS by default. So I think the PBS mix integrated with the app and desktop service is probably a little lower than the average customer. I've been a PBS advocate for a long time, but I think MCS on public cloud is something we're seeing more and more of, and probably explains the mix here. The other being 52% was also a little interesting, but when 26% of that's remote PC, I think a little bit easier to understand. The top apps, I think, are also really interesting. So Epic by session launches is one of the top apps off the app and desktop service. Like I mentioned, we have a couple of customers running at very large scale with Epic in the app and desktop service. Office, Chrome, Kronos, Published RDP, People Connect, Explorer, and SAP are some other ones in there. One other stat I found interesting, though not terribly surprising, when you break down that on-prem resource location distribution, about 30% off vSphere, 6% Nutanix, 5% Zen Server in terms of like the total denominator of that 350K. So still heavy vSphere, Nutanix second, and Zen Server a close third in terms of hypervisor distribution. And by the way, I should have mentioned at the start, if there are any questions along the way, feel free to drop those questions in the chat. I'll do my best to answer them in real time, and if not, I'll always come back to them at the end if I don't see them. So access here is the next question that we always get once there's discussion around current release, long-term service release, and cloud has kind of set a direction. So specifically for customers that are looking at app and desktop service and then maybe workspace, what option are they going to use for the access tier? So there are really two models here, but these two models don't have to be mutually exclusive. So option one is continue to host the access tier, right as part of your resource location, the way that you're probably doing in your environment today. So you still have storefront, probably a gateway, and those are just pointed at your cloud connectors rather than a delivery controller. Option two is obviously to make use of workspace service and the gateway service. So the considerations here, get fairly interesting and primarily focus around resiliency fairly often when I have these conversations. So if you look a little bit more heavily at option one, if the app and desktop service for any reason becomes unavailable, or your 443 outbound connection through your proxy goes down, or the proxy itself goes down, whatever the issue, the option one, where you're hosting the access tier on-prem, gives you the ability to drop into local host cache mode as a fallback plan, the same way that it works with an on-prem environment when your connection to the SQL database is lost. So a lot of customers really like the fallback resiliency that's provided with option one, and at least like to keep this around as a backup plan if they don't determine that this is kind of the primary modality for them in the short term. So if you do decide that option one is the way to go for you and local host cache is critical, there are a couple things to watch out for. The first, again, it only works with the customer hosted access tier, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Second, we're seeing some customers run into challenges with the STA service being detected as down on those connectors that aren't elected as the primary in local host cache mode. And when that happens, they see sporadic session launches only for their external users coming in through the gateway. So customers that haven't been impacted by this have been using the DDC monitor to determine the up and down state of those SDAs as opposed to just the direct ping. We're still doing some additional testing and validation there, but definitely something to look into in your environment, and take a look at which option you have, give it a test, and make sure that SDA up and down state is being detected properly in your environment, so that if you do end up falling into local host cache mode at some point, you have confidence that both your internal and your external use case are going to function properly. For multi-resource location environments, just like with on-prem, local host cache can't broker resources across zones. So zones, resource locations are largely synonymous terms when you're talking about a Citrix cloud deployment. There's two ways to deal with that. So the first is with the latest release of Storefront, there's an advanced health check that you can enable in one of the config files, and that advanced health check will actually check for the resource in each of the zones configured. Or you can set up each zone as an independent site from Storefront's perspective and use site aggregation. So either one will allow resources to launch properly. If you've got the same resources published across all your zones and the capacity to handle it, this won't be an issue. But if your zones publish unique or different resources, we've seen some customers overlook this and have challenges with specific resource types. The next is resource location sizing. So it's a little bit different than the sizing for on-prem app and desktop service. So 5,000 desktop VDAs per resource location and another 500 server VDAs per resource location. Same consideration around CPU sockets and cores. So the way that this local host cache database works, it can only use CPU cores from a single socket. Most hypervisors default to what's called a wide and flat configuration. So by default, if you create a 4 vCPU VM, it will be 4 virtual cores distributed across 4 virtual sockets. And when you're in local host cache mode, you'll effectively be running off of 1 vCPU, which will affect things like re-registration time. So make sure to go and invert that default manually at the hypervisor level so that you've got those 4 virtual cores all running off of a single virtual socket. There are also a couple of events here that are good to monitor for that tell you when you've actually kicked into LHC mode. Can't tell you how many customers I've talked to recently where we go through, their logs and find that at 2 in the morning or something, they dropped into LHC mode and they didn't even realize it. So, good news is LHC did what it was supposed to do, but still probably something you want to be aware of. And then this is something you can test. Some customers redirect with host files or whatever to simulate, but there's actually a registry key you can flip to simulate as well. Okay, couple questions in here. I'm going to pause for those and try to get through them. So the Epic installations you see, are they now primarily on CR backend and LTSR VDA, and have they moved to 1912 from 715? So I would say the overwhelming majority, and I pulled these stats a year ago, and I think it was something like 85-15, so pretty significant. The majority of Epic deployments we see are running LTSR across the board. It's just a higher comfort level, safety in numbers. There's nothing wrong with running CR with Epic, but I would say by and large, the Epic deployments that we see are LTSR, both from VDA and from infrastructure. That said, I will say it's very common for customers to maintain a separate site for their non-Epic workloads, and that's very often CR so that they can get access to the UPM capability that I talked about, or some of the VDA enhancements, whatever it may be. So not common to see both in a healthcare environment, but usually the site or the instance deployed or focused on Epic is LTSR heavy. Next question, can we get these stats somewhere so that I can send them to my management? I believe they'll be made available to you when we do the on-demand version, so you should be able to grab them there. I'll let Katie keep me honest about that, but to my knowledge, that should be something you can get hold of. And then, is there a plan for continued support of SCVMM as the only interface between Hyper-V and Citrix? Currently, we're still waiting on support for VMM 2019. To my knowledge, no announcement. Admin Center. So from a roadmap perspective, I can't comment on that one super intelligently. As you saw with the stats, Hyper-V as a hypervisor isn't one of the top, but in terms of discussions around SCVMM or some alternate modality, I haven't heard any discussions internally that I could tell you definitively one way or another. Good question, and happy to help you follow up offline. I just don't have the answer at my fingertips. Okay, so we talked about option one, which was a customer-hosted access tier. Option two is workspace and gateway service. So the first consideration here, obviously, is that today, right now, the second local host cache mode is not available in this model. It's something that we're acutely aware of internally, and there's a ton of work going to provide similar functionality to provide that sort of fallback mode when users are pointed at workspace with gateway service. So something to keep an eye out for, but right now today that is a dynamic and a consideration. I think the other important consideration here is they're not mutually exclusive. So if you've got that really mission critical business case that you just can't live without, or moments of downtime are costing tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, maybe that's a use case for storefront and having local host cache around. Conversely, if you've got a user community that maybe the aggregated files experience is of high value, or they use a ton of web and SaaS apps, and you want to be able to present those through workspace and some of the SSO capabilities, you've gotten into micro apps, all that sort of thing. Maybe that use case is a great fit for the workspace and gateway service combination. So it's not all or nothing. You can run both in parallel. You can give users the option. And last but not least, workspace is on by default. So that doesn't mean all the service integrations are set up and all that, but we do have some customers that go and set up service integrations and inadvertently provide an alternate access modality into their environment without maybe second factor setup or whatever it may be. without fully understanding or realizing the ramifications. And then if their security team finds it or whatever, and it can just be a little bit challenging. So just be aware that Workspace is on by default, and as you go and set things up, you are creating another avenue into your environment if all of the connectors are in place and the outbound connectivity is there. So just make sure that if you're doing that, it's deliberate. Okay, a couple more questions in here. How can I migrate the on-prem Citrix license server to Citrix Cloud? So you actually don't have to migrate your license server. If you're using WEM on-prem or PBS on-prem, you do need to keep a license server around just for those components. But when you make use of the app and desktop service, all the licensing is hosted service side. And things like the number of licenses you've consumed and whatnot, they'll start based on the users that log in and have their sessions brokered through the app and desktop service. So you don't need to worry about migrating your license server to Citrix Cloud. And one more question. I know that Nutanix has its own workspace. How does the Citrix workspace work with Nutanix, or does it? I actually haven't come across Nutanix's workspace specifically, so I'd be curious to discuss that further, maybe in the roundtable. But I don't have a great answer for that off my fingertips because I haven't worked with it a ton, actually. Okay, so one of the other things that comes up is managing change with Citrix Cloud. So customers are used to having, I think, total control over the change process when they do infrastructure upgrades, when they do BDA upgrades, server upgrades, all that kind of stuff. When you consume cloud services, this isn't unique to Citrix Cloud. Some of that control is relinquished, and it means potentially a change to process and procedures. But there are some things that can be done to help change in Citrix Cloud feel a little bit more familiar and give you some ability to do a little bit more advanced testing. So the first one is test instances are available. 25 license minimum, you can carve them off your entitlement, and you do have the ability to stand up a test instance. We also have two capabilities, preferred time of day and preferred day of week, for connector updates to give you some granularity over managing those. The latter is still in tech preview, I'm almost 100% sure, but something that our most successful customers are definitely turning on. So what we'll see them do is they'll set their pre-production environment to do the connector updates in the middle of the day when they're in the office, paying attention, regularly testing. Maybe their admins run out of pre-prod every day. And if anything goes wrong, they catch it there, and then they'll set their production connectors to upgrade later in the evening, middle of the night, when the use on the system is a little bit less heavy. Day of week, you've got the same dynamic where you can set your pre-prod connectors to update a little bit earlier in the week or during a business day, and then set your production connectors to update during off hours so that if anything does go awry, it's a little bit less impactful to end users. The connector update logic does have built-in protection, so all the connectors in one of your resource locations won't try to patch at the same time. One will kick off. If it fails to update, the next one won't kick off. Same thing with detections around connectors that are allowing for authentication to or AD group retrieval from a certain forest or domain. So that logic is built in to make sure that the connector update process itself doesn't interrupt service in your environment. Again, if all things go as expected. Definitely make sure connectors are dedicated. We've had a few customers co-locate the cloud connector software on a DDC or a domain controller in a couple POCs or something like that. The connectors are reaching out and pulling updates from the cloud service down. They reach out roughly every 5 minutes. If the connector update is available, they may end up rebooting themselves. And if they reboot when they're co-located with another critical service, that can be a problem. And then last but not least, be mindful of security hardening. It's certainly not to say don't do it, but I would say 8 out of 10 times when I see connector update challenges, it was something that was working before and then became a challenge after a GPO with security hardening was pushed around, NTFS permissions, service permissions, which services were allowed to start, all that sort of thing, and all of that can interfere with the update process. So in terms of what else customers are doing and kind of where I think things are going, what else we're seeing, for the longest time we had FlexCast discussions that were like, okay, start with a published application, like it's the most resource efficient experience. If the user needs that desktop experience, a server published desktop is kind of the next most cost effective model. If there's a reason that won't work in terms of app compatibility or resource isolation is really required or something like that, look at a pooled desktop, and if all else fails, you can go dedicated desktop or some flavor like persistent layers. But over the last year or so, we've had a bunch of new, air quotes, FlexCast tools put in our arsenal, and I think customers who do this best are going to make use of them. So where you've got SaaS applications that your users are only using a small part of and they're doing it over and over again, that's where micro apps come into play. Me, I'm a heavy Salesforce and Workday user in my daily job. We publish those through the workspace, and it's probably 8-10 less logons a day for me launching those apps through the workspace as opposed to going around it because we have some really short timeouts internally. It also gives you the option to do some browser isolation and containerization and manage things like copy and paste and print in and out of those SaaS apps to provide some published application-like security without needing to consume server-side resources or VDA resources in your data center. It's also going to save you RDS Cal license costs, so there's some value in that as well. And then obviously we've got all the usual FlexCast models at our disposal, but I think customers are going to look more and more, and have already started to look more and more at how to more robustly deliver that web and SaaS app experience to end users rather than just publishing Chrome and publishing IE like we see so commonly. We still see data all over at customers. It's on-prem file shares. Could be OneDrive, you might be using Box, ShareFile, whatever it is. So it's another one of the strengths that I think exists in the workspace today is kind of that aggregated files view, no matter where they live. Even if you're, an O365 shop and wholesale down the OneDrive path, even just aggregating those files via content collaboration right there into the workspace can be a really positive user experience. Every customer's got kind of a different layout and dynamic here. But it's definitely another trend that I see customers trying to solve for commonly, especially as they try to figure out what to do, like moving file shares to a public cloud, for example. And last but not least, users still need to be protected from themselves, and so does the org. I think last I looked, something like 30% of attacks are still perpetuated by internal users. So the more we can get them out of the data center, isolated from the crown jewels, the better off will be. If you're one of those customers where just not ready for cloud yet, maybe not on the foreseeable future, there are still some major killer features that have come out after 7.15. So if you haven't gotten to 19.12 yet, significant improvements in density based on essentially making some of the processes in the VDA more efficient and being a little bit more efficient with the delivery of some of the HDX capabilities, Server 2019 support, monitoring granularity with directors, so things like app probing, session reliability monitoring, so you know which users are actually having connection challenges, PVS async IO, which I think came out maybe a little bit under the radar. We've run tests with a couple of customers and seen up to like 3x read and write improvements with PVS async IO. So, how often is storage the bottleneck these days in your user experience? Probably not super common, but it also can't hurt. A bunch of examples of improved user experience and fidelity with adaptive throughput, which is kind of almost an alternative or provides some additional flexibility for customers that have struggled with EDT or the UDP and DTLS complexities that go into getting that solution to work. Local text echo came back. MTU discovery, which again is a little bit more of a fidelity and delivery capability, enhanced build to lossless, so a little bit more intelligence in which images are created lossy versus lossless, right from kind of the initial screen painting, drag and drop from local to in session, Office 365 supportability, I think I touched on with some of the UPM 718 stuff and beyond, and then some of the significant HDX Insight scalability improvements that came out, I think it was in 716 and later. So just a couple of key capabilities that have come out since the 7.15 release, if you're still on 7.15 and looking for a reason to move forward. So all in all, some key takeaways. Current release is the way to go if there's a capability you need. If there's not, there's value in the supportability of LTSR. And I don't think this is a static decision, like I said. So LTSR might be appropriate for you now. 2 CRs down the road, we might release that feature you really have to have. And then it's totally okay to move up to current release and stay there until the next LTSR. So, for me, it's current release if there's a capability you need. If there's not, no harm in the additional supportability of LTSR. If you've got a major OS or update coming where you're making an image change, great time to do the VDA update. If not, there's some value in maybe separating risk. If you haven't thought about the cloud model, like you were planning to do a 7.15 to 19.12 update, give it some thought. It does reduce risk, and with the option to automate coming out here in the relatively near future, it significantly reduces the work effort associated. You don't even have to do a VDA update to go that route. If wholesale cloud like app and desktop service isn't for you, but you're entitled to those cloud services, there are some baby steps that are easier to take. You can point analytics at an on-prem app and desktop environment, start gathering security and performance information. The WEM service is an option. You can grab license usage insights right from that on-prem license server and start to get a sense of that as you plan your cloud deployment. And you can also start looking at things like, transitioning your labs, getting used to it, and then some lower criticality use cases, and then maybe the more business critical use cases follow. Same thing with the access tier. That transition can be gradual if you decide workspace is for you, or it can be kind of use case by use case. But all in all, ultimately, this is a business decision in terms of what's right from a supportability perspective, what your resiliency requirements are, all those sorts of good things. So that's all the prepared content I had. I'm going to do a quick comb through the questions, try and get through as many as I can in the last 2 minutes, and we will go from there. Is PBS asynchronous I/O configurable or automatic? It's configurable. VDIS properties. Okay, so the 715% includes CU6. I'm not totally understanding that question. Do you want to clarify, Jeffrey? Does in-place upgrade from server 2012 to server 2019 for VDA work? I don't see almost any customers doing an in-place upgrade from 2012 to 2016, 2016 to 2019 for a number of reasons. It's almost always a parallel build from my experience. So really less a VDA question and much more a question of your organization's process to roll out new server OS versions and master images. All right, I am getting the warning signs that it is time to wrap up. So Greg, I am going to hand it back to you. Apologies if I didn't get to any of your questions, and I'd be happy to get to them in the roundtable if you're able to attend. Greg, if you're there, we are not hearing your audio.
Just a couple quick announcements. To be eligible for the Passport prizes, please visit and interact with our sponsors. Head back to the lobby and that will get you connected with them. We also have a bunch of CUGC swag to give away today. To have a chance, follow my CUGC on Twitter, tweet, ask questions in the presentation, chat with the participants. All of these interactions will increase your chances. Right now, head back to the lobby, and at 2:25, you can join Patrick Cobble or Jerian Gibson's sessions. Thank you.